Thank you very much, dear conference, dear professors. Well, my title can be seen, but anyway, so diversity within the EU, questions to be raised. To be honest, this is a very convenient title because it means that I only need to ask questions but don't need to give answers. But all joking aside, I want to talk about a controversial topic that is not new, but is very much topical and is constantly shaping the present and the possible futures of the European Union. So I'm going to talk about cultural diversity in the EU and the issues to arise in relation to it. Well, the EU has a very attractive motto, which is united in diversity. This motto was first used in 2000, and according to the EU, it signifies that Europeans have come together in the form of the EU to work for peace and prosperity, while at the same time being enriched by the continent's many different cultures, traditions, and languages. Let's put aside that traditions and languages are part of the cultures anyway, and focus on the two elements of the slogan that symbolize what we should think of ourselves as within the EU. The European Union, because it has become an identity-forming institution in its own right over the time, could initially be seen as an entity that poses a threat to cultural diversity. However, the motto has instead foreshadowed a different way forward, one in which diversity and its acceptance and recognition has emerged as some sort of humanitarian achievement. There are two parts to this motto, unity and diversity. What are the considerations behind this? Let us first look into unity. If we are talking about cultural differences to which the second element, diversity, refers, at least partially, and which is one of the contemporary challenges, why, in what way is the unity important? In general, unity is not about uniformity. It is about finding common ground and shared values despite our differences, but this is only the surface, the political slogan from the EU, but lies beneath the surface is one of the primary, one might say, the most important objectives of the existence of the state as an entity, that is the ensuring of social peace. This is the most important public issue. There is unity if we can create tranquility and security. The state must therefore not seek solutions that would pull apart society and plunge into chaos. If anything can create unity, it is the realization of the goal is ensured whether at state or pan-European level. However, it will not work without intervention, action, complex ideas, and programs and cooperation between the actors. How does cultural diversity relate to all of this as the second element? The EU is indisputably culturally very diverse in terms of its peoples. This term is nowadays used to refer to diversity due to immigrant communities, but it has also a much broader concept. At the very narrowest level, European diversity is based on the dominant cultures of the member states, the indigenous groups of Europe like Sami, Inuit, maybe the Basques, and taking the future into account, the Crimean Tatars, just some examples. But there is not even a consensus here in Europe as to which groups are indigenous and which are more national minorities. And we come now to our next group, which are the national and ethnic minorities, and then the very different groups of immigrants. The basis for diversity can be any cultural characteristic. The difficulty is, first of all, that these groups all have different needs. The aim to unity, the unity should focus on is to balance these needs. What about these needs? National minorities have been present in Europe for centuries, mostly perceiving themselves as kind of a distinct society and wanting to establish some form of self-government or autonomy for themselves. In contrast, immigrant communities wish to be integrated into the society as equal members of society, and their demands are not specifically aimed at acquiring self-government, but rather at creating a legal environment and institutions that will eliminate the economic and political disadvantages of these groups and ultimately help society to become more accommodating towards them. But some groups or individuals do not want to be integrated into society. In this case, or in the case of the indigenous communities or peoples around the world, we see that they are often seen by states as groups without the political development to be perceived as a nation, unable to govern themselves and in need of some kind of paternalistic protection, or even as an unfortunate ethnic group or racial minority to be integrated into society. At the same time, their demands may focus on historical justice or the restitution of land ownership as the survival of the indigenous people's distinctive culture, often called pre-modern lifestyles. And it's closely linked to land and resources, which is in fact requires a completely different perspective. In their case, for example, they have to be protected from various influences such as modernization, westernization, urbanization, secularization, and so on. And the dominant cultures are obviously concerned to maintain their dominance culturally, politically, and in terms of resources. And frictions can arise in any relationship. What is our response to all of this? Mostly some sort of non-discrimination politics, which allows groups to be recognized, to exercise their rights. But this often fails to achieve is to create balance, to prevent social unrest. Because what risks are there in these frictions? It is also group dependent. Indigenous peoples, for example, are smaller in number and geographically isolated and therefore pose much less of a threat to the state from the state's perspective, which is why their needs have not been addressed for so long. For national minorities, there are well-developed support system across Europe, or at least we see some good examples for this, but their need for self-government and autonomy and the state's need for sovereignty can be in sharp conflict. Maybe not in reality, but on the level of assumptions, out of mistrust, but this is enough to say that this is a kind of like a landmine in this region of the EU, but not just here. For immigrants, however, the diversity has a much wider range. Some of the cultural differences are not relevant for the state and indeed for other groups in society, as long as these differences remain within the boundaries of private life. The state takes note of the diversity of immigrant groups when the different cultural groups become active in maintaining their culture, and in other words, when the question of belonging to a particular culture is politicized, which then activates the community whose culture is perceived to have been ignored. When a community acts to defend its culture against those who ignore it, it can become a factor that triggers the need for a state response. The resulting conflict situations ultimately threaten social peace, which was one of the most powerful reasons for the creation of the state. In addition, the question is whether it is not too late for the state to take regulatory action, to intervene, or whether it has any chance at all in situations where it has to create a balance not only between the majority and minority, but also between different type of minority groups in a broader sense. At the same time, it is important to avoid, as far as possible, a situation in which national minorities are dissolved in the process of recognizing immigrant groups and their needs, and the state itself, for the state itself not to lose over this whole process. This balance requires the creation of solidarity between communities, and through this, loyalty to the society, and through it to the state, a cohesive society, and thus social peace can be ensured, like theoretically. These groups together form a nation. If they are not bound together by a certain level of solidarity, this can lead to the disintegration of society. Solidarity, loyalty, accommodation, and therefore social peace is the goal to be achieved. This is when we are really united in diversity. It is up to each of us to decide for ourselves whether our own state is capable of mastering these processes, whether it even recognizes them, and whether it has at least a rudimentary integration policy that attempts to address these issues. What if they don't? If there is tension, if there is a lack of loyalty, if there is a threat, social unrest, then we can talk about heterogeneity instead of diversity. Then, instead of coexisting cultures and nations, we have opposing cultural entities, each with its own nationally, ethnically, or religiously defined systems, which effectively act against the state and are a serious source of tension. What can the state do? First, it recognizes the need to intervene, for example, when the emphasis is not on the common culture elements between culturally different groups, and thus on a sense of common belonging, but rather on the cultural differences, those that divide rather than unite in the society. The range of tools is diverse as well. Migration policy is obviously one of them, and it is not controlled. If it's not controlled by the state, it can only run after the outcome. But migration policy has a major impact on the future, and in the present, for example, we can use some kind of educational integration policies. It is a huge challenge itself too. Every culture is basically up of 6 main elements: values, norms, beliefs, symbols, technologies, and language. If the state is to accommodate the needs of culturally diverse groups, it must take these elements into account and adapt its education. It's a very, very difficult method. It is then that the question of who should be at the center of regulation can be answered, distinguishing on the basis of different needs. The group of people who have been living in a country for centuries, and the group of immigrants who, in some cases, do not speak the same language and or have very significant cultural differences, cannot be grouped together. Different needs arise along ethnic and linguistic, religious, or sexual lines. In some cases, they may even be mixed. And the vector of regulation may also be completely different, like reversing the assimilation process, for example, in the case of ethnic minorities, or promoting integration in the case of immigrant groups. It is also not only being sensitive to different races, cultures, social groups, and cultural values, but also about a paradigm shift that involves accepting different ways of thinking as values, and simply taking pluralism and diversity of human thought and culture for granted. There is also the question of the level at which the solutions can be implemented. There must be room for local specificities and variations. But at the same time, theoretically, federalism can also be a solution. At the very least, it is considered to be an ideal arrangement for nationalities striving for the widest possible autonomy, as it can be described as a constitutional instrument that balances the principles of unity and diversity. Federalism can work well when territorial differences are combined with ethnic or cultural differences, as federalism allows for internal self-determination of constituent units. However, for it to work effectively, it is necessary to build a basic trust and consensus between the parties. This is the way to avoid, for example, in the case of national minorities, that minority demands are perceived by the majority as an attempt to secede, and majority demands as an attempt to assimilate. In the European Union, however, such a solution would require a complete rethink of the division of powers and competencies. The issue that arises, how to deal with education, language rights, what is our response to autonomy demands, what is the scope for more multicultural units, and what for those that are less culturally diverse, cannot be dealt with increasingly centralized methods, interpreting principles or through the law development activities for the European Court. But must be discussed objectives jointly set and decisions taken by the member states and EU institutions. If there is no consensus, no clarification of competencies, no clear margin of maneuver, no due consideration of local specificities, this could lead to disintegration too. In addition to identifying the core values that must be protected, the management of specific frictions requires a state of accommodation and balance that counteracts heterogenization. This is the result of a kind of reasoned reflection in which the limits of accommodation are defined. However, it must be also seen that reasonableness itself is a culturally influenced concept, and it is by no means certain that it's a practical solution to define at a central supranational level the differences to which a society must adapt in any case. Finally, something I have not touched yet. What if the society of a given state is not culturally diverse to a degree that would require significant state intervention, or if individual culturally diverse groups do not have the strength to claim recognition? In such cases, a significant degree of centralization can lead to an outcome that is completely alien to the society of the country concerned. Just because the demand for recognition has led to results in some parts of Europe does not mean that in other parts of Europe it is necessary to intervene, for example, in natural assimilation processes. And let's not forget that a period of crisis never pushes forward the willingness to accommodate those who are different. On the contrary. And we have been in a period of successive crisis for about 15 years. There was the economic crisis, then the refugee crisis of 2015, the global pandemic, and now the war. And what happens if a future crisis destroys our efforts? Can we prepare to avoid this, or do we not even try and just let all the flowers bloom, and what will be, will be? Then, well, we can answer the most difficult question of our future. Thank you very much for your patience and attention.